The photograph was only 6 inches wide, slightly faded at the corners, and almost forgotten beneath years of paperwork. Yet the moment Celeste Marlowe saw it, the entire world seemed to stop. There, standing beside her father in bright afternoon sunlight, was a man she had just humiliated in front of an entire conference room. A poor single father in an inexpensive gray jacket, worn shoes, and tired eyes. A man she had called unqualified, desperate, and out of place. But there was something impossible in that photograph. Her father, the stern billionaire who had spent the final years of his life refusing to smile for cameras, was smiling beside him. Not a polite smile. Not a business smile. A genuine, peaceful smile that Celeste had seen only once before in her entire life. Before we uncover why that photograph existed and why one struggling father meant more to Celeste's family than she could ever imagine, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Little Kindness Tales if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of people who refuse to give up. The story began on an ordinary Tuesday morning, when sunlight poured through the enormous glass windows of Marlowe Global's headquarters and painted bright rectangles across the polished marble floor. Celeste Marlowe, 34, stood at the front of the company's executive conference room wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, her dark brown hair tied neatly behind her head. She had inherited the company after her father's death and had spent 3 years proving to everyone that she was not simply a billionaire's daughter. She was intelligent, disciplined, demanding, and almost impossible to impress. Unfortunately, somewhere along the way, she had learned to measure people by what they could accomplish rather than by what they had survived. That morning, dozens of applicants had gathered for a community development position connected to one of Marlowe Global's largest charitable projects. Among them was a 38-year-old single father named Elias Rowan. He arrived carrying a thin folder containing his resume, several handwritten proposals, and a photograph of his 8-year-old daughter, Mira. Elias wore a clean but visibly old gray jacket, a pale blue shirt, and black trousers that had been carefully pressed that morning. His shoes were polished, but the leather had begun to crack. He had spent the previous night working a late shift at a neighborhood grocery warehouse and had barely slept. Still, he had gotten up before sunrise, prepared breakfast for Mira, packed her school lunch, walked her to the bus stop, and then taken 2 buses across the city for the interview. He was not chasing luxury. He was chasing stability. His wife had died several years earlier after a long illness, leaving Elias to raise Mira alone. Since then, every decision he made had one purpose, making sure his daughter never felt that her life was smaller because their family had less money. When Elias entered the conference room, some executives barely looked up. Celeste studied his resume and immediately noticed that he did not have the prestigious university degree possessed by most applicants. Instead, he had years of practical experience organizing food drives, helping families find temporary housing, and coordinating neighborhood repair projects. He had never managed a corporation. He had never worn an expensive watch. He had never attended one of the elite schools that filled Marlowe Global's executive offices. Celeste asked him to explain why he believed he deserved the position. Elias calmly described a community center he had helped rebuild after a severe storm. He explained how he had persuaded local stores to donate supplies, organized volunteers, and created a system that helped families receive food without having to stand in humiliating lines. He spoke not like a polished executive, but like someone who had personally stood beside people when they had nowhere else to go. Celeste listened for less than 2 minutes before interrupting him. She told him that good intentions were not the same thing as leadership and that Marlowe Global needed professionals, not people who confused personal hardship with qualifications. Her words became sharper when she noticed his worn jacket. She questioned whether he understood the scale of the company and whether he could truly represent a billion-dollar organization. Elias looked down briefly at his folder. There was disappointment in his face, but no anger. He simply closed the folder and thanked her for her time. As he turned toward the door, Celeste noticed a small photograph sticking out from between his papers. She did not know why, but the image caught her attention for a moment. It showed a younger Elias standing beside an older man. She dismissed it. That afternoon, Elias returned home to a small apartment above a bakery. Mira was sitting at the kitchen table doing her homework while sunlight streamed through the window. She immediately noticed her father's expression and asked how the interview went. Elias smiled and told her that sometimes people said no before they had the chance to understand what you could offer. He reminded her that rejection did not decide a person's worth. Mira nodded, then quietly pushed half of her sandwich toward him because she knew he had skipped lunch. That tiny gesture broke something inside him. Elias smiled and told her that she was becoming too generous for her own good. Mira simply replied that he had taught her to share. The next morning, Celeste arrived at Marlowe Global expecting another ordinary day. Instead, her father's longtime assistant, Arthur Bellamy, asked to see her privately. Arthur had worked for her father for more than 25 years and rarely showed emotion. He carried a locked archival box into Celeste's office and told her that he had found it while organizing her father's private records. Inside were old letters, receipts, community reports, and dozens of photographs. Celeste began sorting through them without much interest until she found one particular photograph. She froze. Her father was standing outside a modest community center on a bright summer afternoon. He was younger, perhaps 55, wearing a simple white shirt with his sleeves rolled up. Beside him stood a younger Elias Rowan, his arm around a little boy. And in the middle was a little girl with dark hair and a missing front tooth. Celeste recognized the girl instantly. It was her. Her hands began to tremble. She turned the photograph over. On the back, written in her father's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "The day Elias reminded me what my money was supposed to mean." Celeste stared at the sentence for several seconds. She had never known Elias. Or at least, she thought she had not. Arthur quietly explained that years earlier, when Celeste was a child, her father had visited a struggling neighborhood after hearing about a community center that was about to close. Elias, who had been volunteering there, had convinced him not merely to donate money but to spend an entire afternoon meeting the families who depended on the center. Celeste's father had arrived expecting to write a check and leave. Instead, Elias had shown him what happened when wealthy people gave money without listening to the people they were trying to help. That afternoon changed everything. Celeste's father eventually funded the center, but he insisted that Elias help design the program. The two men became close friends for several years. Elias had even saved Celeste's life during a frightening accident at a crowded community event when she was a child. Her father had written about it in one of his private journals. Celeste remembered that day only as a blur of sunlight, noise, and her father suddenly pulling her close. She had never known who had helped her. Now she did. And the realization hit harder than anything she had experienced since becoming CEO. She had mocked the man who had once protected her. She had judged him by his jacket while her father had judged him by his heart. Celeste immediately asked Arthur to locate Elias. They discovered that he had been working multiple jobs while raising Mira. His community work had continued quietly for years. He had never mentioned his connection to Celeste's father because he believed the friendship belonged in the past and because he did not want special treatment. Celeste drove to Elias's neighborhood that afternoon. She expected him to be angry when she arrived, but instead she found him outside the bakery carrying a box of donated food toward an elderly neighbor. The sun was still high, and children were playing across the street. Elias recognized her but said nothing. Celeste stood several feet away, suddenly unsure of herself for the first time in years. She apologized. Not as a CEO. Not as an heiress. Just as a person who had been wrong. She told him about the photograph and showed it to him. Elias looked at the image for a long moment. His expression softened when he saw Celeste as a little girl standing beside her father. He explained that her father had been different that afternoon. He had listened. He had laughed. He had even eaten lunch with families who normally avoided people like him. Then Elias said something Celeste would remember for the rest of her life. Her father had told him that wealth was only useful when it made someone else's burden lighter. Celeste looked down. She suddenly understood why her father had smiled in that photograph. He had not been smiling because he was rich. He had been smiling because, for once, he felt useful. Celeste offered Elias the community development position, but Elias did not accept immediately. He asked whether the company truly wanted someone who would challenge its decisions when they hurt ordinary people. Celeste told him that was exactly why she wanted him. Elias eventually accepted, but only after Celeste agreed to one condition: the project would be redesigned around the people it was meant to serve. No unnecessary luxury offices. No publicity campaigns pretending charity was generosity. No treating struggling families like statistics. Over the following months, something remarkable happened. The project became one of Marlowe Global's most successful community programs. Elias helped create affordable childcare partnerships, food assistance networks, job training programs, and emergency support for single parents. Mira occasionally visited the office after school, and even the executives who had once looked down on her father began greeting her warmly. Celeste changed too. She began visiting neighborhoods without cameras. She listened more than she spoke. She learned that leadership was not about being the loudest person in the room. Sometimes it was about having the humility to recognize the person everyone else had ignored. 1 year later, Celeste stood outside the same community center where her father had once taken that photograph. A new plaque had been installed near the entrance, honoring the volunteers who had kept the center alive. Elias stood beside her. Mira stood between them, holding the old photograph. Celeste looked at the picture again. Her father was smiling. Elias was smiling. And little Celeste was standing between them, unaware that the two men beside her were teaching her a lesson she would spend the rest of her life learning. She finally understood that her father's greatest legacy was never the company he built. It was the people he chose to believe in. Before the story ends, if this journey touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to Little Kindness Tales. Sometimes one small act of kindness can travel through years and return when we need it most. And here is the special request before the ending. Comment: kindness always comes back. If you believe that a person's true worth can never be measured by their clothes, money, or social status. As the afternoon sun began to soften over the neighborhood, Celeste placed the photograph carefully inside a frame and handed it to Elias. She told him that her father had left behind billions of dollars, but somehow this little photograph felt more valuable than all of it. Elias smiled and reminded her that the photograph was not really about her father, or even about him. It was about a moment when someone chose to see another human being instead of seeing their circumstances. Celeste looked at Mira, then at the community center filled with families, children, and volunteers. For the first time, she understood the smile in the photograph. Her father had not been celebrating what he owned. He had been celebrating what he had finally learned to give. And years after that photograph was taken, the lesson had found its way back to his daughter through the very man she once believed had nothing to offer. Sometimes life hides its most important lessons inside the people we are quickest to judge. Sometimes the person standing in front of us with the least money carries the greatest wealth of all. And sometimes, the stranger we look down on today turns out to be the person who reminds us who we were meant to become.